analogous to what can happen within an individual psyche. We are going through a collective shamanic initiation, a genuine near-death or death and rebirth experience, in which our world is turning upside down and inside out. Something within us, reflected by events in the external world, is falling apart and dying, potentially to be reborn and recreated in a new, more coherent and integrated form. Historically, shamans have been the first physicians, psychotherapists, artists, spiritual emissaries, prophets, translators, mediums, magicians, entertainers, culture heroes, and storytellers. Shamanism is the oldest form of healing in the world. Just as dreams are the unconscious way of balancing a one-sidedness in the individual psyche, the shamanic archetype is the dynamically evolving pattern of healing that is catalyzed in the collective unconscious as a compensatory response to the ongoing violence, suffering, and trauma that is being acted out on the world stage. As Jung repeatedly warned, if we don't understand the powers of darkness within, the unconscious, that are emerging in our world and deal with them, we will be fated to suffer the consequences of our blindness. Encountering the dark forms of the unconscious invariably activates the shamanic archetype within the collective unconscious. We as human species, as well as individually, are making a shamanic descent into the underworld, the netherworld of the unconscious, the shadow within our psyche, where we must face our own dark side. We all have shamanic abilities, whether we know it or not. These gifts are an intrinsic part of human nature. We are at the point in human history where we have all gotten drafted into an archetypal shamanic initiatory process, and the sooner we wake up to this and try to understand our role in this process, the better.
Trauma and recovery. The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Milan Kundera. One of the difficulties of our predicament is that once having suffered atrocities, the walls you've constructed become a part of your body and do not come down of their own when immediate danger has passed. Judith Herman said, "In the aftermath of trauma, people see danger everywhere. They're jumpy, they startle easily, and they have a hard time sleeping. They're irritable and more prone to anger. This seems to be a biological phenomenon, not just a psychological one. People also relive the experience in nightmares and flashbacks. Any little reminder can set them off. Sometimes people understand the trigger, but sometimes they won't have complete memory of the event. They may respond to the reminder as you did by becoming terrified or agitated or angry. Sometimes it's very subtle. This reliving, these intrusions, are not a normal kind of remembering, where the smell of cinnamon rolls, for example, may remind you of your grandmother. Instead, it's like playing the same videotape over and over, a repetitive sequence of terrifying images and sensations." She continued, The third group of symptoms people have, and these are almost the opposite of the intrusive nightmares and flashbacks, the dramatic symptoms, is a shutting down of feelings, a constriction of emotions, intellect, and behavior. It's characteristic of traumatized people to oscillate between feeling overwhelmed, enraged, terrified, desperate, or in extreme grief and pain, and feeling nothing at all. People describe themselves as numb. They don't feel anything. They aren't interested in things that used to interest them. They avoid situations that may remind them of the trauma. What happens, I asked, thinking not just of myself, if a person is traumatized repeatedly or systematically? People begin to lose their identity, their self-respect. They begin to lose their autonomy and independence. Because people in captivity are most often isolated from other relationships. That this is so in normal captivity is obvious and intentional, but it is overwhelmingly the case in domestic violence as well, as perpetrators often demand their victims increasingly cut all other social ties. They are forced to depend for basic survival on the very person who is abusing them. This creates a complicated bond between the two, and skews the victim's perception of the nature of human relationships. The situation is even worse for children raised in these circumstances because their personality is formed in the context of an exploitative relationship in which the overarching principles are those of coercion and control, of dominance and subordination. Whether we are talking about adults or children, it often happens that a kind of sadistic corruption enters into the captive's emotional relational life. People lose their sense of faith in themselves, in other people. They come to believe or view all relationships as coercive, and come to feel that the strong rule, the strong do as they please, that the world is divided into victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and rescuers. They believe that all relations are contaminated and corrupted, that sadism is the principle that rules all relationships. Just describe the principles that undergird our political, economic, scientific, and religious systems. And there are other losses involved, a loss of basic trust, a loss of feeling of mutuality, of relatedness. In its stead is emplaced a contempt for self and others. If you've been punished for showing autonomy, initiative, or independence, after a while, you're not going to show them. In the aftermath of this kind of brutalization, victims have a great deal of difficulty taking responsibility for their own lives. Often, people who try to get help get frustrated because we don't understand why the victim seems so passive, seems so unable to extricate themselves or to advocate on their own behalf. They seem to behave as though they're still under the perpetrator's control, even though we think they're now free. But in some ways, the perpetrator has been internalized. This seems to be tied to mourning what was lost. Part of the motivation for the idea of let's not talk about it is the belief that you can go back to the way you were before the trauma. And what people find is that's just not possible. Once you've seen up close the evil human beings are capable of, you're not going to see the world the same way. You're not going to see other people the same way. And you're not going to see yourself the same way. We can all fantasize about how brave or cowardly we would be in extreme situations, but people who've been exposed know what they did and what they didn't do. And almost inevitably, they failed to live up to some kind of expectation of themselves. There has to be a sense of grieving what was lost. It's only after that mourning process that people can come through it and say, that was a hard lesson, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but I am stronger or wiser. The recovery doesn't end with the telling and hearing of the story. There's another step after that, which has to do with people reforming their connections, moving from a preoccupation with the past to feeling more hopeful for the future, feeling that they have a future, that it's not just a matter of enduring and going through life as a member of the Walking Dead. Instead, there is an ability to knowingly affirm life, even after surviving the worst other people have to dish out. And I do think that what renews people is the hope and belief that their own capacity to love has not been destroyed. When people feel damned and doomed, and they feel they can't go on living, the fear often has to do with the feeling that they have been so contaminated with the perpetrator's hate and taken so much of it into themselves that there is nothing left but rage and hate and distrust and fear and contempt. When people go through mourning and through their crisis of faith, what they come back to as bedrock is their own capacity to love. Sometimes that connection is frail and tenuous, but whether it is with animals, nature, music, or other humans, that's the bedrock to which they must return, to that one caring relationship the perpetrator was never able to destroy. And then they build from there. I think as people move into their lives again, the ones who do best are the ones who've developed what Robert J. Lifton calls a survivor mission. I've seen it happen so many times that people turn this experience around and make it a gift to others. That really is the only way you can transcend an atrocity. You can't bury it. You can't make it go away. You can't dissociate it. It comes back. But you can transcend it. First, by telling the truth about it, and then by using it in the service of humanity, saying, this isn't the way we want to live. We want to live differently. In the aftermath of terror, many survivors find themselves much clearer and more daring about going after what they want in life and in relationships. They straighten things out with their families and lovers and friends, and they often say, this is the kind of closeness I want, and this is the kind of stuff I don't want. When people are sensitized to the dynamics of exploitation, they are able to say, I don't want this in my life, and they often become very courageous about speaking truth to power. I have heard so many survivors say, I know what terror is. I will live in fear every day for the rest of my life, but I also know that I will be all right, and that I feel all right. And I have heard them join others in saying, this is the thing we want to protect, and this is the thing we want to stop. We don't know how we're going to do it, but we do know that this is what we want, and we're not indifferent. Sometimes through atrocity, people discover in themselves courage that they didn't know they had.
Because, the studies we've done up to now, many of them are sort of DSM oriented.
Yeah.
Because you need that in order to get approved from the FDA.
Yeah.
But of course, the DSM is a completely non-scientific instrument. And
these are the diagnostic categories used in psychiatry and psychology these days.
So people study those categories,
yeah,
but they're really non-existent categories. They don't tell us anything about.
Oh, let's get into that in a minute. I love this. All right.
and so then people say, oh, it works in the serotonin system. Now we understand this. No, nobody is studying mental processes.
Right.
Nobody studies what gives people a sense of self, what gives people a sense of understanding me and others. Those are not serotonin issues. These are very complex mental phenomena that I've studied quite a lot of. I was sort of student of Piaget about mental processes that happen, and the mind has sort of disappeared out of our field.
Do you really think that's true in the domain of clinical psychology? Because there's a tremendous amount of research about mental states and traits, including sometimes they're neural correlates, but very often even without that physicalized reference.
There's some research being done in that direction. It doesn't get funded very well. And we have a lot of speculations about neural networks and mental processes, but they have not in no way, shape, or form been nailed down.
Mm-hmm.
And what people find is not it's that particular chemical or that particular brain area. It's about the connection between all these systems.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the Webb telescope. Our mind is like, it is so complex with so many multiple layers. And so at this point, we're looking at the mind through Galileo's little telescope instead of through a web telescope.
Sure.
And people pretend like it's a web telescope. No, that's a lousy little thing. I think we can measure at this point.
I'll ask you a question about this. We recently did an episode focused on diagnosis, how the DSM works, how people get diagnosed for various ailments, all of that stuff. And as part of that, we gave a lot of caveats about the nature of these different labels, whether they are categories or labels at all, or whether it's better to kind of just think about them as different sort of kind of tendencies that people have, and so on and so on. So we're pretty diagnostic light on the podcast in general. But I think that you used a phrase a second ago about the DSM, where something, to poorly paraphrase you, is something along the lines of these fictitious diagnostic categories. I don't want to get too in the weeds here, because most of the people who listen to this are not psychiatrists, but would you mind expanding on what you mean by that?
Well, I was, by luck and by longevity, part of this process.
Yeah.
So, I'm training at this Harvard hospital many years ago, and people are beginning to find some drugs that seem to change depression and might change schizophrenia. Around the same time, people are beginning to know something about brain chemistry, and we get the technology to look at brain chemistry. And so we have two new technical things. And then we created DSM. And why did we create it? Actually, it started off as research diagnostic criteria, so that if we study the effect of certain antidepressants, a laboratory in Los Angeles and in Boston and London all sort of measure the same thing. And so that's how we started to do drug research at the time that we thought that drugs really would make a big difference. And so now we have an agreement about what do we call for certain behaviors. So we cobbled together something with and we have no scientific data, but we have little committee meetings of people who treat these patients, and we sort of come to a consensus, not on the basis of scientific stuff, but on sort of clinical immersion. But that looks like a category that more or less belongs together.
Yeah.
And so DSM comes out, and Bob Spitzer writes in the preamble, this is just an attempt at categorization. It is too inaccurate to ever be used for insurance or forensic purposes. That paragraph disappears in subsequent editions, and now people believe that these lists of symptoms actually are a disease. No, we created this very goodness of our intellect and our mind in order to see what drugs would work for what particular symptoms. Now it turns out that these drugs are not particularly helpful, but it also turns out psychiatry has become a bunch of drug pushers who don't know anything about anything else anymore. And so psychiatry sort of committed suicide as a profession.
I am going to teach you how to become a psychiatrist. The first thing that you're going to need to know how to do is to diagnose your patients. So let us start with a connect the columns exercise. In column A, we have a list of symptoms. These cover a majority of the patient's problems that you will face. First, I'm feeling, lost in my life, sad, lonely, like it's all meaningless. If you connected it correctly, it goes to major depressive disorder. Next we have, I don't know if there's anything wrong with me exactly, though I do get anxious about the state of the world in general. That one is generalized anxiety disorder. Then we have, I keep hearing a voice in my head, a man's voice, and he says the words hollow and empty and thud. That one goes to schizophrenia. And then we have, I stopped taking my Zyprexa and I feel pretty strange now. And my last psychiatrist said I was bipolar. That one connects to bipolar disorder. And the final one, I know you'll probably label it borderline, but I just think a lot of this psychiatry is bullshit. That's clearly a sign of borderline personality disorder. Now, once you have come up with a proper diagnosis for a person, then you have to figure out what code to give them. Then what you can do is you can bill. So for the first, we have borderline personality disorder. What code goes with that? It is actually F60.3. And which code goes with generalized anxiety disorder? It's a little tricky. It's F41.1. and schizophrenia, that most difficult and complex of disorders? It is F20.0. And now we have major depressive disorder. If you guessed F33.1, you are correct. And finally, we have bipolar disorder. If you said F31.60, you are correct. So now let's move on to what some might consider to be the most important part of psychiatry, and it's definitely the most difficult part. This is how to treat people. So in column B, we have a list of potential treatments. We have individual psychotherapy, socialization groups, exercise and sleep maintenance, olanzapine, an antipsychotic, which is also known as Zyprexa, and finally, dialectical behavioral therapy. Well, since I'm trying to be brief for this and I don't want to waste a lot of your time, let's just cut to the chase. You're never going to get in trouble if you just make sure, regardless of somebody's diagnosis, just put them on olanzapine. Just prescribe them olanzapine. It works for everything. That's why we have the term off-label. Yeah, we can talk about some other things that might help afterward, but since we are biologically trained practitioners, we've been trained in science, we've been trained in the brain, we know that it's most effective to treat people with brain interventions. And you can explain to them, they have chemical imbalances. Yeah, even though there's not a lot of scientific evidence proving that there are chemical imbalances in the brain, it's very hard to study brain chemicals. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about the science. Really, people don't care about that. The medical field doesn't care about that. The main thing is you tell them there's science behind it, because that will get them to take their medication. So let's move on. Now that we've got everybody on Zyprexa, what do we do if Zyprexa doesn't work? Column B, we have a whole new list of medical interventions. First, we have risperidone, known as Risperdal. Then we have aripiprazole, also known as Abilify, ziprasidone, which is also known as Geodon. We have haloperidol, Haldol. And finally, we have quetiapine, also known as Seroquel. Well, the answer here is probably not exactly what you'd expect, so listen carefully. Actually, you can give any of these to any of these diagnoses if Zyprexa doesn't work, and you're really not going to get in trouble, because very, very rarely do people actually sue psychiatrists and win anything. And of course, remember, you have malpractice insurance, so if someone does sue you and gets away with it, you're not going to lose anything anyways. Yeah, your rates are going to go up, but it's pretty unlikely, and you're going to be making so much money, it's not going to really make a difference anyways. The other thing you can also do is you can give multiple different ones of these drugs. You can throw in Paxil, you can throw in Zoloft, you can throw in Prozac, lots of combinations. That's the basis of being a psychiatrist. Remember, always give more drugs. You never get in trouble if you give more. You can give people 3 drugs, 4 drugs, 5 drugs, and you can also combine that with electroconvulsive therapy, shock therapy to the brain. So now I'm going to go into the multiple choice section of how to be a psychiatrist. What do you do if patients are feeling unpleasant side effects from their psychiatric medications? A, instruct them to be patient, to continue taking the medications, and to wait. B, tell them that their mental illness is causing them to misperceive their feelings. C, do you prescribe another psychiatric drug to combat the side effects? D, point out that these side effects are much less of a bother to society than are the symptoms of their mental illness, and thus the prescribed treatment is actually effective. E, tell them their 15 minutes is up and they can bring up the question next month in their next 15-minute appointment. Or F, any or all of the above is correct. Well, if you guessed F, you are right, and you are well on your way to becoming a psychiatrist.
DSM III and the Revolution in the Classification of Mental Illness. February 2005, Journal of History of the Behavioral Sciences. Authors Rick Mays and Alan Horowitz. Abstract. A revolution occurred within the psychiatric profession in the early 1980s that rapidly transformed the theory and practice of mental health in the United States. In a very short period of time, mental illnesses were transformed from broad etiological logically defined entities that were continuous with normality to symptom-based categorical diseases. The third edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM III, was responsible for this change. The paradigm shift in mental health diagnosis in the DSM III was neither a product of growing scientific knowledge nor of increasing medicalization. Instead, its symptom-based diagnoses reflect a growing standardization of psychiatric diagnoses. This standardization was the product of many factors, including 1. Professional politics within the mental health community, 2. Increased government involvement in mental health research and policymaking, 3. Mounting pressure on psychiatrists from health insurers to demonstrate the effectiveness of their practices, and 4. The necessity of pharmaceutical companies to market their products to treat specific diseases. Psychiatric practice in the first part of the 20th century did not place much stake in particular diagnostic categories. The first official manual of the American Psychiatric Association, APA, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM I, from 1952, reflected the views of dynamic psychiatrists, especially of Adolf Meyer, the most prominent American psychiatrist of the first half of the 20th century. Specific diagnostic entities had a limited role in the DSM-I and its successor, the DSM II, from 1968. These manuals conceived of symptoms as a reflection of broad underlying dynamic conditions or as reactions to difficult life problems. Dynamic explanations posited that symptoms were symbolic manifestations that only became meaningful through exploring the personal history of each individual. The focus of analytic explanations and treatment, therefore, was the total personality and life experiences of the person that provided the context for the interpretation of symptoms. The DSM-I and II made little effort to provide elaborate classification schemes because overt symptoms did not reveal disease entities, but disguised underlying conflicts that could not be expressed directly. Carl Menninger, a leading dynamic psychiatrist at the time, argued that separating individual mental disorders into discrete categories with unique symptom characteristics, scientific medicine's modus operandi, was a mistake. Instead, Menninger viewed all mental disorders as reducible to one basic psychosocial process: the failure of the suffering individual to adapt to his or her environment. Adaptive failure can range from minor neurotic to major psychotic severity, but the process is not discontinuous, and the illnesses therefore are not discrete. Rather than treating the symptoms of mental disorder, he urged psychiatrists to explain how the individual's failure to adapt came about and its meaning to the patient. In other words, what is behind the symptoms? In 1972, John Feiner, then a resident in the department, codified and published 14 of these diagnostic criteria in what came to be known as the Feiner criteria. Spitzer used these criteria for his classificatory model of mental illness, and the faculty at Washington University and the students they had trained became his major allies in the development of the DSM III. In determining what would and would not be considered a mental disorder, the membership of Spitzer's task force was hugely consequential. Spitzer selected a group of psychiatrists and consultant psychologists who were committed primarily to medically oriented diagnostic research and not to clinical practice. Clinicians with other non-medical backgrounds were included only later in the process, after the DSM III's medically oriented and symptom-focused ground rules had been set. Rather than focusing on any underlying psychological causes for mental disorders, Kraepelin stressed classifying them according to their unique symptoms, course of development, and eventual outcome. In his view, depression, schizophrenia, and so forth were different just as mumps and pneumonia were different. Generally speaking, science inherently requires classification schemes. Using infectious diseases as an example, for scientists to be able to identify and eradicate tuberculosis or malaria, they first need to be able to distinguish the two both from each other and from other diseases. Epidemiology represents the formal study of classifying diseases according to rational and empirical criteria. For psychiatry to be a medical science, it had to devise a similar epidemiological scheme for classifying mental disorders, known as a nosology. Kraepelin's approach to psychiatric classification, explains Alan Young, was based on three ideas: that mental disorders are best understood as analogues with physical diseases, that the classification of mental disorders demands careful observations of visible symptoms instead of on inferences based on unproven causal theories, and that empirical research will eventually demonstrate the organic and biochemical origins of mental disorders. During the DSM III's drafting, representatives virtually begged Spitzer and his task force to standardize the manual's diagnostic criteria so that insurers could separate legitimate mental illness from non-psychiatric problems like floundering marriages, trouble raising children, and the difficulties in finding meaning in life. As the insurance companies saw it, medical insurance should only be asked to cover medical mental disorders. Insurance is meant to pay for the sick, not the discontented who are seeking an improved lifestyle. We need your help in differentiating between those who have mental disorders and those who simply have a problem. Yeah, there you have it. Once the task force reinserted neurosis and neurotic into the final draft of the DSM III The APA's Board of Trustees formally approved it for publication in 1980. In retrospect, Spitzer admitted the politics associated with the neurosis controversy was a source of unavoidable embarrassment for many psychiatrists. With the DSM-III, for the first time, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and counselors had one common language to define mental disorders. This language became the code by which all mental health clinicians communicated with both the payers that provided financial reimbursement, insurance companies, managed care operations, the government, and the organizations that would come to pour billions of dollars into mental health and psychopharmaceutical research in the years ahead. Pharmaceutical companies and the government. In addition to changing the language of mental health, the DSM-III created enormous professional and financial incentives for both researchers and pharmaceutical companies. It gave them specific diagnoses to target their research and develop efforts for prospective treatments. Under the DSM-I and II, large-scale clinical research was impossible because the manual's lack of reliable diagnostic categories precluded replication by multiple researchers. In addition, the Food and Drug Administration would not approve the marketing of medications unless they were shown to be effective in the treatment of specific illnesses. The FDA requirements helped ensure the dominance of the DSM-III symptom-based model.
How do we help reach the field of psychology, which seems to be infected with ego?
Yeah. That's really interesting because I just gave a presentation, to a whole bunch of psychologists, and then a friend of mine who was one of them, he reflected back to me, they all thought I was mentally ill. And this literally just happened. So I'm not making this up. So I understand the question. People who were really I think of Jung. Jung said modern psychology is like psychology without the psyche. They forgot about the psyche, And so the idea being is that, because I've never taken a class in any of this stuff, but I'm a student of the psyche. And I think that's what psychologists need, is to really contemplate, according to Jung, the greatest discovery of the 20th century in psychology, in his words, was the discovery of the reality of the psyche. That the psyche had an ontological reality, and that our visions or dreams or intuitions, that they were ontologically as real as the physical matter. And so unfortunately, modern psychology has gotten really entranced in the whole scientific, materialistic point of view. They think that matter is primary instead of consciousness. And so many of the people, they're just behaviorists, or they deal with pharmaceuticals. And instead of, how about just connecting with the person? And, because I think maybe even more than half of what we're all suffering from, it's true for me, was not being seen. Like when I was going through my experience of trying to heal from this incredible abuse that I received from my father, and then I got thrown into psychiatry, they absolutely, they could not register, the abuse that I was openly trying to transmit to them that I was suffering from. And then they overlaid on me a misdiagnosis. And then on top of that, they didn't recognize the spiritual awakening part. And then on top of that, they then medicated me. And then from all of that, I became sick. And as soon as I became sick, that confirmed their diagnosis. Oh, he really is mentally ill, because look how sick he is. And I could not believe the abuse that I suffered from psychiatry. But as my awakening continued, I began to understand that was part of my awakening. That was like a descent into the hell realm. And I never would have believed in a million years that that went on.
I encountered words by Carl Rogers in his book On Becoming a Person that seemed to speak to my experience as a learning human being. It seems to me that anything that can be taught to another is relatively inconsequential and has little or no significant influence on behavior. I've come to feel that the only learning which significantly influences behavior is self-discovered, self-appropriated learning. Such self-discovered learning, truth that has been personally appropriated and assimilated in experience, cannot be directly communicated to another. As soon as the individual tries to communicate such experience directly, often with a quite natural enthusiasm, it becomes teaching, and its results are inconsequential.
When we identify with a fictitious separate self, and as long as we do that, then it's like we have a cocoon around us and we're suffocating ourselves.
Right.
So it's forcing us.
Paralyzed, yes.
Yeah, and turned to stone, exactly. And then when we actually have the recognition of what's being shown to us and we hook up with other people, through a real open heart and empathy and love and compassion and really helping each other, in their own process, of course, and we get as much benefit as they do because we're not separate. And keep in mind that Watiko is at the bottom of that. That was actually the inspiration for that whole process of us awakening to who we are. Because when we awaken to who we are, you discover, wait, I'm not who I've been imagining myself to be. I don't exist as a separate self. And that there's a way of conspiring with each other, of being together and inspiring each other, and that's the sacred activism. And in a way that is the total antidote, but it's also the offspring of Watiko. But it's funny because when I first found out about the phrase sacred activism that Andrew had coined, I had been using the term spiritually informed political activism, where you have to sort of bring together spiritual awareness, and it's not just something, that you're passively sitting in your room, meditating, doing mantras, and everything's going to be good. No, the world's burning. And you're just too self-absorbed if you don't realize that your inner process is manifesting as the outer world. They're not separate. And so when we actually have whatever understanding we have and whatever form of awakening that's coming through us, and then connect with other people who are also awakening, and when you connect with other people who are also tapping in to who they are and what they're here to do, it's contagious. It actually, the creative genius, it's what I call, we can conspire to co-inspire each other. It's a real conspiracy theory where it activates the collective genius in a way where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And then all bets are off, because like I've been saying, and I'll say it this way, we have the diagnosis. I mean, Watiko is a perfect diagnosis for what's happening, but it's meaningless unless we take it online into our psyches, because it's a participatory medicine. We have to step into it, and that's like quantum physics. We have to step into it and engage with the world to activate the healing benefit of the medicine that's encoded in Watiko, or it doesn't do us any good. We could have all the diagnoses we want, and it's meaningless. And I want to point out that the cure, the solution of all the myriad world crises, it's already been discovered. We have it. We possess it. Every one of us. We already have what we need. It's not like something outside of ourselves is going to come and enlighten us or save us. No, we already have the medicine. We have everything we need, but we don't know we have it. And that's what I'm trying to point out. And that's what I'm trying to do in my life, is continually cultivate and to deepen my realization of this.
The people in my classes, including me, did not need to be controlled, managed, or even taught. What we needed was to be encouraged, accepted, and loved just for who we were. We needed not to be governed by a set of rules that would tell us what we needed to learn and what we needed to express, but to be given time in a supportive space to explore who we were and what we wanted, with the assistance of others who had our best interests at heart. I believe that is true not only for my students, but for all of us, human and non-human alike. All we want Whether we are honeybees, salmon, trash-collecting ants, ponderosa pines, coyotes, human beings, or stars, is to love and be loved, to be accepted, cherished, and celebrated simply for being who we are. Is that so very difficult?
When someone is called to be a shaman, there is no external shaman who can heal them. The would-be shaman has to find the resources they need within. They need to call forth from within a totally unique and creative way that applies only to them. The path of healing that they discover, though an iteration of a deeper archetypal universal pattern, is not already known in the collective and therefore does not follow a prescription. It has to be each person's own way. This is another way of saying that through the shamanic initiatory process, the apprentice is required to discover their own unique creative self. A sacred calling. Shamanism is a sacred vocation in that the would-be shaman is called by the voice of their inner true nature. How our life turns out depends on whether we hear this call and how we respond. If the person so summoned by the spirit of the unconscious refuses the call, they typically become neurotic, sick, and possibly even psychotic, and will probably die an early death. Assenting, saying yes to our deeper shamanic calling, activates the universal support of our initiatory ordeal, as the universe is the agency that has sponsored our calling in the first place. Due to being wounded and traumatized by life itself, the shamanic archetype can become spontaneously activated in us whether we consciously know it or not. Instead of cursing our brokenness or our abusers, we can instead recognize that this is a numinous event, an archetypal, creative, and potentially redemptive moment that seeks to make us participants in